I'll first introduce our speaker, Dr. Whitney Nell Stewart. She's Associate Professor of History and faculty of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. She is the author of the award-winning, and wonderful if I do say so myself, This Is Our Home, Slavery and Struggle on Southern Plantations. She also publishes in outlets ranging from the Journal of the Early Republic to Smithsonian Magazine. Her work has been supported by various organizations like the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Huntington Library, and the American Philosophical Society. Dr. Stewart also consults with museums, historic sites, and groups like the National Park Service and TxDOT. Please welcome Dr. Whitney Stewart.
Howdy, y'all. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm especially excited because I get to be on a panel with my friend and colleague, Tara Dudley, who you'll hear from in a little bit. But just first, a thanks to all of you for being here, and a thanks to everyone who's put together this really incredible day of scholarship and of community. So thank you. I want to talk a little bit today, not just about what happened in the past, but about how we remember and present it to the public, specifically about the narratives we tell about slavery and plantations in Texas, and how the stuff of history, the objects, the material culture, can help us in the quest to tell fuller, more truthful, more challenging, and honestly more interesting stories about history. Now, the debate about what and whose stories are told at historic plantation sites and who gets to make the decisions about that. I don't get to make the decision to advance my slide, apparently. It's the big button, right? Big green button? Okay. Oh, hello. I even get audio, how nice. But the debate about who's making the decisions, right, about what kind of stories are told at historic plantation sites, it's definitely happening in the public sphere. You may have heard about last year's controversy over the Texas Historical Commission's decision to pull books about racism and slavery from the museum shops of two of their state-owned historic plantation sites. And this happened after one white woman complained about their presence. You can actually see pictured here from the Texas Monthly article about the controversy, Varner Hogg Plantation State Historic Site. This is in Brazoria County, Texas. Has anyone ever been to Varner Hogg here? I do recommend that you go. It's about an hour's drive southwest of Houston, where I grew up. They've been working really hard over the past decade or so to shift what stories are told there, which includes convincing the state that their interpretation needed to change, convincing them that they did, in fact, need to talk about racism and slavery. And thanks to reporting like this at Texas Monthly, as well as behind-the-scenes work of those really hard-working site staff and fierce advocating by historians, the books have been returned to the shelves, and they've even added new ones, including my recent book. But this very recent example highlights actually a longer history of conversations and decisions made, often behind closed doors, about what stories are supposedly significant enough to be represented at sites like this one, which for more than half a century told a story of Texas that aligned closely with what we can call the heroic Anglo narrative of Texas, downplaying, ignoring, and even erasing enslaved people from the site. And in many ways, the name itself, Varner Hogg, reflects this. Varner signifies Martin Varner, who was one of the old 300 who was given this plantation in 1824. And Hogg, the last owners, the last white family who owned this plantation site. You might know Hogg from James Hogg, the first native-born governor of Texas. And this erases what happened actually in between Martin Varner, who sold the plantation in 1834, and Jim Hogg, who bought the plantation in 1901, which is its existence as a plantation, the antebellum and postbellum, when it was called Patton Place, when it was a thriving sugar plantation with dozens of enslaved people and later convict laborers who were living and working there. Now, the person who crafted this long-standing traditional narrative of Varner Hogg, who made the decisions behind the scenes, was the person who donated the site to the state in the mid-20th century. This woman here. Anybody know who it is? Ima Hogg. Yes, indeed. The very misfortunately named Ima Hogg. Jim Hogg purchases the plantation in 1901. She and her brothers inherit the site upon his death in 1906. They use it as a summer home, but it was in 1918 that Jim Hogg's dream came true when a huge oil well was found on the property. This is where the Hogg money comes from, is the oil from the plantation site from Varner Hogg. Now, Ima Hogg gives Varner Hogg to the state in 1958, and she gives it as a state park, including its buildings, like the Plantation Mansion, which she had transformed into a museum to what she called the Texas Pioneers. Oh, also her dad, who was not a Texas pioneer, but who she wanted represented. And she had a hand in every single part of executing this transformation from a private residence into a public museum. She had her hand in the tour. We have a recording of her giving the tour as she wanted it done. The design of the museum, we have dozens of letters about what she envisioned for this place to be. And it was a stipulation of her gift to the state that the tours and the museum be represented in a certain way. Her interpretation, we have what would now today call an interpretive plan. She might not have called it that, but she had a narrative of what this place needed to be saying. Now, to do all of this work, she needed to enlist some help. So she brought along a friend who would be a researcher, Alice Kilman, who in the late 1950s began researching in archives, including in the Brazoria County Courthouse. And it was there that she began to find a little more than what she had anticipated, as she found evidence that Columbus Patton, who was the owner and slaver of the plantation during the antebellum era, had been accused by his siblings of living, quote, in disgraceful intimacy with one Rachel, a slave. Now, Columbus was a bachelor. He never married. And for nearly a decade, roughly from 1844 to 1854, Rachel lived as what those in the community called the, quote, mistress of the plantation. She acted and purchased goods like the lady of the house. She also demanded respect like one, not only on the plantation, but also in town. She actually sat with the white churchgoers in the Methodist Church. This history had apparently been forgotten, at least by some people in the community, for Alice's words and actions expressed shock and dismay. And she said as much when she wrote to Ima, quote, "We don't have to tell the world about that." Silence. That was her recommendation. And it's one Ima would adopt. She made a choice to erase Rachel from the history of Varner Hogg Plantation. And that was reflected in her narrative that she wrote about the site, a narrative that would guide Varner Hogg's interpretation for decades and decades. And this was the story of Texas, as she called it, that thousands upon thousands of visitors would engage with. This narrative did include a small portion about the Pattons. It mentioned slavery briefly, though it should be noted that Black people are only ever mentioned in relation to their labor. But it's kind of like lost cause with the Texas twang. For Ima, the history of Varner Hogg was a history of the white families who made this place home. In this telling, there is no Rachel. There's no enslaved black woman who ran the Patton household, who directed black and white labor on the plantation. But Ima's historical choices don't actually mesh with the reality of the history of the plantation. For the primary sources so clearly show us, there are a couple of documents from that Brazoria County courthouse. Rachel is everywhere. She is an essential part of this story. She's all over the antebellum court cases that Alice Kilman was searching through. She's also in the 1930s WPA narratives, including from individuals like Sarah Ford, who you can see here, who was born enslaved at Patton Place. And, as I argue in my book, Rachel can be found in the landscape, the buildings, the furniture, and other material things that actually make up the plantation. Material culture offers us so much. It expands the sources that we can use as evidence, something particularly important when recovering and centering the histories of those who did not leave ample written records behind. It encourages us to reassess the written records that we do have, and it can also provide corroborating evidence for those records. So I want to dig in a bit as to how objects can help us go beyond Ima Hogg's traditional narrative. So first, objects can help us put Rachel back at the center of the narrative. In the 1990s, there was an archaeology dig at Varner Hogg, and archaeologists found fragments of several different ceramic patterns around the mansion. And most of those dated from the period from the 1830s to the 1850s. And for a long time, it was assumed and interpreted that these ceramics were about the white family, especially Columbus Patton's mother and his sisters. But when we put these material remains in conversation with court case records, which assert that Rachel lived as, quote, the mistress of the plantation from roughly 1844 to 1854. And this is a time, by the way, when those white Patton women were not living in the mansion. Those broken pieces take on a whole new meaning. They are reflections of Rachel's aesthetics and taste. For as Lady of Patton Place, we know that she made decisions and purchases for the household. So interpreting ceramics in the dining room of Varner Hogg Plantation site through the lens of Rachel can do so much to show her significance to the site. Second, objects can help us discern more about Rachel's role, her actions, and her life at Patton Place. We know from those court cases that Rachel would sit, talk, and eat with Columbus Patton in the dining room and in the parlor. Now, this may seem like pretty standard stuff, but these were intimate acts for any man and wife to partake in, let alone any enslaving man and enslaved woman. Along with the domestic practices that Rachel was performing in the parlor and the dining room, she also would have used the material culture of these rooms. And she would be showing her taste and her style and thus her position as lady of the household. But what were these objects? Well, Columbus Patton's father left an inventory in 1840 when he died that divulges some of the furniture in the mansion. You can see here a sofa and 2 settees, likely where Columbus and Rachel sat to converse. Perhaps these looked a little bit like the sofa and settee that would have been in the house. Now, we don't know exactly what they would have looked like. This is one of the many difficult parts about doing material culture, is that it's often the absence of the things that we're left with. We have the written record that is telling us something about the physical material objects. But context tells us that they likely looked something like this. Now, if we were to interpret a sofa and a settee in the Varner Hogg mansion in this way, visitors could get a glimpse into Rachel's position in the household, the actions she took to project a degree of authority, and the emotional labor that she was required to perform for Columbus. It also allows us an opportunity to connect Rachel's story to that of other enslaved Texas women. There are several different Texas cases of an enslaved woman living as this, quote, lady of the household with an enslaving man, including Sabrina and John Clark. Now, Rachel's story, as told through objects like these, can open up so many questions about life for enslaved people on Texas plantations, because Rachel was both remarkable and representative. Yes, she cultivated a really remarkable amount of domestic influence in the Patton Mansion, but that authority was tenuous at best. Although available sources point to the fact that her relationship with the plantation's owner, Columbus, was intimate, and I use this term very intentionally because it's one that indicates both carnality and a kind of emotional closeness, but it existed like all other relationships within the context of slavery's cruelty and constraints. So while some enslaved Texas women like Rachel manipulated the domestic practices and material goods of white Southern ladyhood for their own purposes, it was never enough to secure them real control over their own lives and bodies. And it certainly couldn't protect Rachel. Columbus was deemed non compos mentis by Brazoria County in 1854. In other words, he was deemed insane, in part because of his relationship with Rachel. And with that, Rachel was taken from her position in the household and forced into the fields. She became a toy to be played with by the other members of the Patton family. She was manipulated by them and eventually exiled to Cincinnati, Ohio. While there, she did gain her freedom papers, but she was determined to return to Texas to, as she put it in an 1870 court case, quote, her old house on the Patton estate. When she got there, her freedom papers were stolen, and she was forced to labor as an enslaved field worker until emancipation. Even after freedom, though, she wanted to stay at Patton Place. She wanted to be allowed, quote, a home on the estate of C.R. Patton, but she was denied. Why would she go so far in trying to get back to the plantation where she had been enslaved? So far as to even risk and eventually lose her freedom. And how do we tell these stories without invoking a lost cause inflected happy slaves in happy homes narrative? I've been talking about this for a long time with the Varner Hogg site staff. It's a really delicate balance, but it's one that we have to hash out. Because yes, Rachel's story complicates those that we tell on Texas plantations. Not only that old heroic Anglo narrative, but even the idea that these sites existed simply as labor camps. Because this place was Rachel's home. She said so herself. It's not just the home of Columbus Patton or Martin Varner or James and Ima Hogg. If we want to tell the real history of this place and of Texas, we cannot ignore Rachel, for her choices, her taste, her existence is written all through the archive and found in the very ground of the plantation. And there's more material culture at Varner Hogg that can help us tell other stories of slavery and freedom on Texas plantations. There are brick foundation remains of slave cabins, which after emancipation were transformed into freedmen's cabins, where Black men, women, and children lived for decades. And around that brick rubble, there's more evidence of their lives. Some of that joy that Kelly Carter Jackson was talking about. In February 2023, the archaeologist Molly Morgan and her Rice University crew found a buckle. And I was there when it happened. It was so exciting. You can see some in-progress pictures here. They hypothesized that this is a shoe buckle from the late 19th century. And a buckle like this would not have been worn on a workman's shoe. This was a buckle for a Sunday outfit, a special get-up worn while on one's own time. And its periodization, the late 19th century, suggests to us a reality obscured by IMA's traditional narrative. That Black residents of Patton Place were not just workers, that they had tastes they wanted to express through fashion during hours and days that were their own. That despite attempts of oppressive institutions to make it so, their Black bodies did much more than just labor. And their full humanity, their lives in full, must be recognized here. So objects like a shoe buckle, slave cabin foundations, ceramics, sofas, can help us tell the history of slavery on Texas plantations. Now that history is not simple. It challenges what we assume, and that can be scary, especially in an age when Texas politicians want teachers, museums, historic sites to tell simple stories that align with their political ambitions. But our job as historians, no matter where we work or who we're talking to, is to figure out how to tell stories that are both rooted in the past but also meaningful to us today. And the things left behind offer us an additional way of investigating, interpreting, and narrating that history, and it makes our history tangible. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Tara Dudley. Dr. Dudley is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. Her scholarship examines the contributions of African American builders and architects to the American built environment, focusing on the antebellum and Reconstruction eras of the U.S. South. Her work reflects an interdisciplinary approach to the study of cultural resources, with a focus on 19th century American design, African American architectural history, historic preservation, and material culture. She is the author of the multiple award-winning book, Building Antebellum New Orleans, Free People of Color and Their Influence. She served as a senior architectural historian for Austin-based preservation and consulting firm HHM and Associates for 2 decades and continues to consult on preservation projects across the country. Please welcome Dr. Dudley.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to also express the sentiments of my fellow speakers and colleagues and friends on how exciting it is to be with you all here this afternoon to convene a conference on slavery, especially in a place like Texas. And so thank you all for your interest and your time for being here. I'm going to jump right in so I don't get a paddle thrown at me, and so that we all can get to the reception that follows this particular session. But I'll have you know that it's very hard to talk about decades of builders with intention and identify them as humans in 20 minutes. So here goes. Throughout the antebellum U.S. and its territories, the labor of enslaved men skilled in the building trades was exploited by slave-owning architects, contractors, and craftsmen, or was hired out to others by their enslavers. The Texas frontier was no different. From Anglo-American settlement in 1821 through the advent of the Civil War, whether in urban or rural locales, enslaved craftsmen and builders played crucial roles in the development of Texas's built environment. Today's talk offers a survey of only a handful of these contributions and re-examines the lives and roles of both known and unknown enslaved builders in an effort to place them more firmly within the history of Texas's material and architectural culture. The first Anglo-Americans who settled in Texas came from the southern United States, as we've learned, and were accustomed to using enslaved persons of African descent as an important source of labor. Slavery grew slowly from 1821 to the start of the Texas Revolution. Most Anglo-immigrants who came to Texas owned few enslaved people. Jared Groce, a native of Virginia, was one exception. Groce left his residence in Alabama in 1821 to settle on the Brazos River at present-day Hempstead in Waller County. There, he was granted title to 10 leagues of land in exchange for bringing with him 90 enslaved men, women, and children. Their labor contributed to the construction of a 1.5-story cabin with 6 rooms and an upstairs hall. Enslaved men chopped down and shaped the cottonwood logs for the cabin's frame and the walnut columns for the front gallery that extended across the front facade. The extensive plantation, called Barnardo Plantation, which you can see here, included a significant number of other support and auxiliary buildings, all of which would have been erected by enslaved laborers. In 1833, Groce relocated to a smaller 3-league plot of land in Grimes County that he called Groce's Retreat. Among the 20 enslaved who he relocated to the new plantation were builders who constructed the dwellings as well as a sawmill and other buildings. George C. Childress drafted the Teclis Declaration of Independence at Groce's Retreat in early 1836. After Texas achieved that independence from Mexico, the new nation slowly came into its own. Like urban areas in the United States, growing cities like Galveston and Houston afforded the enslaved the opportunity to live separately from their enslavers and sometimes hire out their own labor, especially those more skilled as cooks, blacksmiths, or carpenters. In Houston, the Republic of Texas's first, if temporary, capital, a man named Ben took advantage of his position and knowledge early on. In mid-February 1838, Robert Forbes placed an ad in the Telegraph and Texas Register on behalf of Ben's enslaver, Dr. D.A. Berry of Columbia. It read in part, "Ran away from the subscriber on the 20th of January, a Negro man named Ben. He is 6 feet high and proportionally stout, complexion rather light of cast for a Negro, forward in his manners, and when in liquor, which he is very fond of, impudent, is a rough carpenter." Ben was brought to Houston in the early part of December by Dr. Berry and remained there some 10 or 12 days, where it is most probable he is now, end quote. The notice specified not only Ben's physical appearance and personality traits, both good and bad, to aid in his identification, but also noted his value as a carpenter. Having been brought to Houston a couple months prior, Ben had potentially escaped bondage to return there. The ad offered $20 for his apprehension. Certainly, Ben knew his own worth in the growing city of Houston and developing Republican, especially with his skill as a carpenter. Perhaps the most significant, if not well-known, enslaved builder during the 1840s was Joshua Houston, who was enslaved by Sam Houston, and a biography of him was highlighted by Dr. Berry this morning. Joshua helped to build at least 2 of the Houston family's homes at Cedar Point and Raven Hill. Joshua was born in Marion, Alabama in 1822, one of the individuals who Temple and Nancy Lee held in bondage. When Temple died in 1834, he was within his rights to give 12-year-old Joshua to their 15-year-old daughter Margaret to serve as her personal slave. At some point while still in Alabama, Joshua became a skilled carpenter. In their biography on Joshua Houston, Patricia Prather and Jane Monday offer that, quote, "Because Joshua was skilled at working with his hands, he also began learning carpentry skills and apprenticed in wood making. He was intelligent enough to be aware that on large plantations like the Lees, the slaves with the most skills became the most valuable and so were treated the best," end quote. When Margaret Lee married General Sam Houston in 1840, Joshua was among the enslaved who she transported to Texas. After being sent to serve General Houston in the city named after him, Joshua was next sent to assist other enslaved people in readying the general's home and property at Cedar Point, located on Cedar Bayou near Galveston Bay. Joshua would have utilized his skills to transform Houston's bachelor's quarters to a family home and repair furniture that arrived damaged from Alabama. After his second term as president of the Republic of Texas ended in December 1844, Houston settled his family and their slaves at Raven Hill, a plantation approximately 11 miles east of Huntsville that he had recently acquired. While still traveling in East Texas during his presidency, Houston had placed Joshua in charge of erecting a home for Margaret. Joshua interpreted Houston's design for a 2-story home with 2 rooms on each floor, flanking an open hallway. The exterior was to have 12-foot wide galleries, the length of the whole building. The house was similar to the one at Cedar Point, only bigger. It was constructed from logs squared with axes, and the windows were simple openings covered by slab shutters. The chimneys were wide and built of native rock. The kitchen was a separate building in the yard. It was among additional buildings still being constructed by Joshua and the other enslaved people on the plantation when Margaret Houston took up residence. Texas statehood came on the heels of Sam Houston's presidency. In February 1846, Austin was officially declared the state capital, and the languishing city grew. As in rural areas, enslaved individuals in Austin raised livestock and tended homes. They were also involved in building and manufacturing trades. Due to a frequent labor shortage in the growing city, enslavers in Austin regularly hired out their slaves to those in need. The city's continued development and need for slave labor was guaranteed when the election of 1850 determined Austin as the state capital for the next 20 years. Assured of a government presence and a steady population, Austin quickly expanded and prospered. The state constructed permanent buildings, institutions required churches and schools, and wealthy residents commissioned mansions of stone and brick. These buildings were supplied by local enterprises that also exploited the work of enslaved laborers, including lumber mills in Bastrop and Austin area limestone quarries and lime kilns. In 1852, the Texas state government authorized construction of a permanent state capitol building. A handful of amateur architects and other contractors contributed to this project. Among them, Abner Cook, A.W. Moore, Charles L. McGehee, and Thomas H. Jones were enslavers at the 1850 census, holding in bondage men who would have been of age to contribute to this building project. On January 3, 1854, the Texas State Gazette printed that Abner Cook hired 9 black men to be paid $280 for their labor and provided with room, board, and clothing. The notice, pictured here at the top right, does not make clear if the men were free or enslaved or to whom this compensation was remitted. Also unknown is the exact nature of their contributions. Perhaps they engaged in quarrying and hauling limestone from George Washington Davis's farm 4 miles northwest of the Capitol building site. Otherwise, they would have conducted work supervised by Cook, Moore, Jones, and Hendrickson. Men enslaved or hired by Cook were instrumental to his prolific output during the 1850s, when he was credited as the master builder for no less than a dozen Greek Revival-style homes in Austin, including the Texas Governor's Mansion and the Washington and Mary Hill House, included here with several other buildings. The slave quarters, erected as part of the complex of outbuildings for the Hill House, is the only extant slave quarters building in Austin today that is physically recognizable as such. It is unknown if Cook's slaves, the Hill slaves, or a combined group built this structure in the primary dwelling. The handcraft and carpentry and masonry skills of these men have been revealed through careful restoration of the slave quarters building. I might add award-winning restoration, as we have worked over the past few years to restore this structure and also interpret more broadly the stories of individuals enslaved and not who were involved with this particular site. And in order to give more of a broad talk on enslaved master builders of Texas, I kind of lied in my abstract saying that I would highlight this building in particular, but I'm happy to answer more questions about it. Cook's peer, Thomas H. Jones, immigrated to Texas in 1846. In 1855, 2 years after his contributions to the state capitol building, Jones was part of the team who built the Travis County Courthouse and was also contracted to build an impressive commercial building for merchants George Sampson and Abram Hendricks. And those structures are also pictured here. Archival and genealogical research, as well as architectural evidence, indicate that these projects were actually completed by an enslaved mason named Samuel. Samuel and his wife Dicey were both born in North Carolina and brought to Texas via Tennessee as the human property of the Jones family. The first-hand account of a visitor to the Jones farm reveals that Samuel was trained in Tennessee and was the builder of Jones's two-story limestone house with 2 rooms flanking a center passage on each floor, a standard Upper South I-house plan configuration. The incorporation of a typical Greek Revival layout here is one hint that Samuel possessed knowledge of classically derived forms. Central Texas, with its abundant limestone deposits, provided a building material with which Samuel would have been familiar, since Nashville and the Middle Tennessee region are rich in limestone. The Jones house is also notable because it is constructed of a smooth finished ashlar limestone. This further ties Samuel to the masonry traditions of Middle Tennessee, since more Texas builders were accustomed to building with rough-hewn limestone. Middle Tennessee was also home to Irish immigrant stonemasons who taught their trade to enslaved black people. Perhaps this is how Samuel acquired his skills. A portion of the primary or south facade of the Jones house features limestone blocks laid up with an alternating square and rectangular face pattern resembling Flemish bond brick masonry, and we can see that pictured here at the left. This technique, meant to structurally reinforce the solidity of a double-wide brick or stone wall, also suggests that Samuel was trained among bricklayers. It is exciting to speculate that Samuel resisted the material that he was given to work with, limestone, as if laying bricks, and chose to work and lay the material in that pattern. The fact that the Sampson Hendricks building, a detail of which is pictured here on the right, also features Samuel's trademark Flemish bond limestone construction allows us to expand his resume and give him authorship of both of these buildings. Samuel, then, was crucial in Jones's success as one of Austin's foremost building contractors during the 1850s. As a testament to his skill, self-identification, and empowerment as a stonemason, Samuel adopted the surname Mason after emancipation and passed his name and trade on to his sons and future generations. Many an enslaved craftsman learned a skilled trade from an enslaver who was a trained artisan. Other slave owners fostered training opportunities. In Rusk County, Matthew D. Ector placed 3 of his 8 slaves, quote, with the best carpenter the country could afford in order to materially enhance their value and skill as workmen, end quote. In the Huntsville area, enslaved carpenter Jordan Goree was encouraged by Dr. Pleasant Cottrell, a white man who was not Goree's enslaver. Dr. Cottrell maintained Goree's finances while the latter saved money to purchase his own freedom. Further, Dr. Cottrell apprenticed his own slave, a man named Billy, to Goree so that Billy might learn the trade from an experienced master builder of not only homes, but also of cotton gin houses and cotton screws. Goree was skilled at building and maintaining cotton presses like the one seen in the upper right of this image. He was particularly versed in the precise manufacturing of the carved spiral shafts for cotton gin presses, making him extremely lucrative in a cotton growing industry. Enslaved men like Sam, Goree, and countless others skilled in the building trades not only labored for the benefit of white Texan society, but for that of the enslaved community as well. When interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, a woman named Mandy, whose family was enslaved in Texas, noted that because her grandfather was the plantation carpenter, their slave dwelling was, quote, fixed fine and had regular windows and handmade chairs and a real wood floor, end quote. Carrie Davenport, who is pictured here, was formerly enslaved from Walker County. He relayed that his father was a plantation carpenter. Their enslaver allowed Carrie's father to have lumber that he then used for a variety of purposes, including making furniture, clothing storage, spinning wheels, and parts of looms. In addition to the 2-story main house that Carrie's father likely had a hand in building, he also would have constructed the wood-frame slave quarters building that his family occupied, while the other enslaved people on the plantation lived in houses made of rough-hewn logs. On the eve of the Civil War, when the work that enslaved craftsmen produced for plantation owners and for white builders was at its height, Texas's slave economy remained in full swing. Around this time, an enslaved carpenter in Marshall, Texas, sold for $2,755, or over $92,000 in today's currency. An enslaved craftsman skilled in the building trades then was worth the equivalent of a luxury car today. The plight of enslaved Texas craftsmen should focus not only on the artifacts and structures that they created, but the agency with which they did so. Whether through force or encouragement, enslaved African Americans gained invaluable skills and maneuvered social and economic systems against them. This knowledge provided them with the agency to establish, build, and prosper in various post-Civil War environments across Texas. Laura Cornish's family was part of that trend. Her father had been a carpenter on the plantation where the family lived while enslaved and remained just after emancipation. One year after a poor crop harvest, her father moved the family to Houston, where he found a job doing carpentry work. He was not alone, as numerous freedmen, builders, and craftsmen migrated to other parts of the state seeking enfranchisement and better opportunities. The antebellum experience of enslaved builders is a crucial, if underexplored, part of the Texas experience. From the settlement of the frontier to the founding of a new republic, meeting the needs of planters and statesmen, and shoring up a plantation society, the contributions of the enslaved were insignificant to empire-making and place-making. While television and film and other popular media have begun to explore the roles of master carpenters and builders, they serve as the backdrop to a much larger story. The specific stories and personal and cultural agency of enslaved builders in Texas and throughout the United States deserve so much more. Thank you.
We'll be happy to take some questions. There's a microphone here in the center of the room if you'd like to come up.
So this one's for Dr. Dudley, and that is, have you searched the, not only the census records, but also legislative efforts, because anybody who is a free black had to seek permission from the legislature to remain in Texas. And I'm sure some of those would, in the efforts of communities to keep valuable human resources available to them, would have expressed the fact that this person was providing a valuable service, like carpenter and so forth. Has that kind of research been done?
So that's actually one of the methods that I'm using for my ongoing work. I've published a book on the contributions of free people of color to architecture in New Orleans specifically, but New Orleans, Louisiana more broadly.
Everyone should read it. It's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's in the bookshop.
It's in the bookshop. It won a lot of awards.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And see, this is all day, and Dr. Stewart has also authored an award-winning book. It's titled Building Antebellum New Orleans Free People of Color and Their Influence. And so I've encountered many of those kinds of resources studying Louisiana, and among the work that I'm doing now for not my current book project, but the next is to write about builders, specifically in Austin and Central Texas, but to uncover more of those stories by looking at documentation and archival material like legislative documents, so yes.
There's a question I've been dying to ask architectural historians, and that is whether the front porch is an Africanism. On a trip to Africa as a student many years ago, saw houses that were very familiar, cottages that were very familiar to my experience in South Texas. So I wonder what light you might be able to shed on that. To me, what was to me a revelation.
Either of us could take that question, and the short answer is yes. Especially when you think about the places to which others came from, where a porch was not a necessity, and it's definitely a sort of circum-Caribbean feature of American, if we think about America more broadly and not just the North American, the United States, a feature of American architecture. People needed space to gather, to live outside, protect themselves from the elements, whatever they might be. British colonists did not need porches and outside spaces in the same way that people who were coming to the American South, the Gulf South did. And so yes, that is a contribution, but very much I use the word creolized a lot in my work, especially as I study Louisiana, Mexico and Louisiana and those relationships. But it definitely is a feature that is an American feature of architecture, and one that was that African enslaved people did contribute.
I have a question. You all do such a brilliant job of bringing together what Dr. Stewart has called a constellation of resources, primary source research in terms of documents, but also material culture research, the built environment. Can you tell us a little bit about your process for how you start to interrogate those archives and bring them all together, and reveal a little bit of the secrets of this material culture built environment study that you do?
Well, I have to say places like where we are today are essential. And I was trained in a fairly traditional history PhD program at Rice University. But once I found material culture, I never looked back. And my real training took place at the Bayou Bend collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, with Winterthur, with going to and learning from people who are at museums. So places like this are absolutely essential. And so for me, I would say if you're interested in incorporating material culture into historical work, however you pursue that historical work, whether it's for family history, community history, archives, the classroom, whatever it is, reach out to local public history organizations, museums, and while I do know that curators are overworked and underpaid, they're also so generous and excited to have folks using their materials. And so, you know, make it a two-way street, make sure that you are doing something for them as much as they are doing for you. But first step has to be getting connected with folks in the museum world and collections who are every day doing this work.
I was also trained, if you will, in more traditional methods as an art historian, as an undergraduate. And so understanding the sources and methods of historical research was influential and absolutely instrumental, understanding how one can maneuver the archives. But also for me, my work is much more interdisciplinary. I study and teach interior design, design history, preservation, history, and so on and so forth. And also, for me, architecture in the built environment is not so much about just the material culture, the tangible object that we can see, or maybe that we can't if it's something that is no longer present or has been destroyed. It's about the people, which is why I talk about builders so much. And so thinking about then how to combine those various approaches and methods in a way that is very interdisciplinary, how to go after identifying the people who made a space or inhabited a space and ask the questions on how to find out information about them is extremely important, especially as Dr. Berry so rightfully said, we always and very often say, you know, there's not the documentation or we don't have the information. And 9 times out of 10, thinking a little creatively sometimes about how I might answer a question will lead me to that source. And sometimes an archive isn't even aware that that material is in there because, you know, we're just getting into like the metadata and digitizing things. But if something is named after, you know, white person planter papers and, you know, the name of enslaved person Lizzie is mentioned in there. You know, Lizzie is not indexed in the finding aids and things of that nature. And again, it's answering the questions for a project that I've worked on recently at the University of Texas and identifying African Americans who've contributed to campus construction. My thing was, okay, to find out who worked for the campus, like, let's follow the money. Like, there's always a money trail, right? And so to think about how people got paid, we knew there was a voucher sister. Where are the vouchers, if not the paychecks? And the Briscoe Center had these documents that were in boxes off-site and ultimately revealed these vouchers of people, white, black, Hispanic, who had worked on the campus in the late 19th and early 20th century, and there being able to find out the names of people. And that was a two-part process because then we had the list of people who were working on campus or labored on campus, and they might have been working on buildings, picking up trash, planting trees. It just kind of depended, but they were involved with the built environment. And then we had to do the next step of doing either directory or census research to locate those people to find out their race or ethnicity. And so it's really sometimes thinking about the question that you want answered and then trying to figure out what that source is and find where that source is and bug the archivists and the museum people and librarians until you find it.
I want to add too, I think that point about asking different questions of objects, buildings, documents is so important. For more than a century, decorative arts and material culture was seen as a prissy, elitist, white endeavor, and it was. But it has taken folks doing work like Taya Miles and others, you know, going back a couple, you know, 2 generations or so, John Michael Vlatch, to be asking questions not about, you know, does this fit into the like Newport style, the kind of connoisseurship aspect of material culture, but instead shifting to other questions about the people that harvested the mahogany to make that dresser, the people who were sold based on what was written on that desk. And you know, and Dr. Berry, you know, pointed this to this today with the Worcester Art Museum reference. It's shifting the perspective and asking new questions. It's great to find new stuff in the ground. I love archaeologists. Thank them every day. But we can also just be asking different questions of the same stuff that we've been looking at and get new answers back.
Thank you all for joining us. Now is the time to relax and breathe. We have a reception in the South Texas Heritage Center, and then we will gather back together in the maze for Annette Gordon-Reed. Thank you.